You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 5 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover, and I am thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. So today, we are going to be talking about the Hell Gap site. It is a National Historic Landmark. And for those of you watching YouTube, the podcast on the YouTube, I'm still recording from home. I've still been traveling a lot. I'm actually in between 2 trips at the moment. I head to Japan next week to present at the National Academy of Science, Frontiers of Science. So when this comes out Thursday, I'll be just getting ready to come out and get ready for my trip to Japan. Also, like I said, still at my apartment. I haven't moved my recording stuff over. I am recording this Monday evening, a couple days before this is due, and it is 7 o'clock. It is Laramie's dinner time. She has her food, but this is the witching hour of my very, very adorable black cat. So she's going to be around and probably a little noisy. So last episode, we talked about the Paleoindian period. We talked about peopling of the Americas. And I wanted to begin focusing on specific sites in the Great Plains. And that's why I wanted to bring up Hell Gap National Historic Landmark. Hell Gap, with the site designation, I think it's like 48 GO 305. Yeah, so 48 GO 305. That is the Smithsonian trinomial for Hell Gap. And it is a deeply stratified Paleoindian site. I believe that there's some also like transitionary Paleoindian to Archaic, but it sits on a archaeological preserve, which the Wyoming Archaeological Foundation purchased. And so the Hell Gap site itself is made up currently of 5 localities. But there is more archaeology on the site itself. And so what I mean by localities is that there's 5 different areas of excavation. And the most famous one is Locality 1. And Locality 1, that's where we find the most, that's the area that's most well known in terms of excavation for having multiple Paleoindian complexes or different times of occupation or human culture. So, but I'm starting to get ahead of myself. Where is Hell Gap? Well, Hell Gap is in the state of Wyoming. It's in kind of the southeastern corner. It's like an hour and a half north of Cheyenne, about 30 minutes northeast by dirt road of Guernsey, Wyoming. So it's right on the cusp of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. So the site itself sits in the Hartville Uplift, which is a zone of positive topography. Dipping back to some of the earlier episodes where we talked about the Great Plains geologic landscape. It has incredible raw material for lithic stone tools, right? So the Hartville uplift, for those that are familiar, it is a gorgeous type of chert that can be mined out of the Hartville uplift. It's like a orange with sometimes it moving a little bit into that red zone with these gorgeous like black dendrites. It is a very pretty stone, and it opens up. The site itself is in a valley, area, and you look due east, and it's just the Great Plains. So you can, if you imagine yourself in time going back to Hell Gap in the surrounding area, if you hike or climb up on the ridges around the site and around that Front Range area, I mean, you can just peer into the Great Plains, which is a really great lookout spot for bison. And Hell Gap itself, there's a lot of bison remains, butchered bison that have been excavated out of the sites here. So I mean, that's what it was. It was a hunting camp, a bison processing area, right? When we're talking about Paleoindian archaeology, looking about 15,000 to 13,000 years ago, there are not settlements or towns that we think people are not living in place for very long. It is very much temporary encampments. People are hunting there. And the site was, as the story goes, discovered in the 1950s by two students. I've heard a couple different versions of how the site was found. There was like a snowstorm, prom was involved. Sometimes it was just students. Like, I'm not entirely sure, but it was found by two individuals who, for some reason or other, they were just kind of like digging out there, and they came across some archaeology, and they reported it to the University of Wyoming, and archaeologists predominantly from in the 1960s, from Harvard, I believe. I think it's Harvard. Let me double check. Yeah, Harvard. I should know that. The 1960s, specifically between 1962 to 1966, really excavated by two folks. It was a team, and they were doing field seasons every summer. Henry and Cynthia Irwin, as well as C. Vance Haynes. Like, there were some really cool characters that were present at Hell Gap. Some really famous photographs that came out of there, and they're the ones that recognized how important this site was. And there's this famous photo called the Witness Wall, right? They excavated this huge block out and left a wall on the excavation that had all the stratigraphy, and they put little nails, like railroad nails, like that. The tops look like these really big circles into the wall where they found a cultural complex. So there's this really famous photo, two of them, one of this big archaeological meeting of Henry Irwin presenting the Witness Wall to his colleagues, and they're all along the edge of the site. And then there's one of just the Witness Wall itself, where you have Clovis, Folsom, Midland, Agate Basin, Hell Gap, Alberta, Eden Scotts Bluff, Lower Frederick, Upper Frederick. And then towards the top, once we get a little bit closer in time, you have Patton Creek and Sudbury. And it has such a mythos to it, that site. Cynthia and Henry Irwin, their siblings. Henry did not live into adulthood. Cynthia became a very well-known Southwestern archaeologist, and Henry Irwin did his dissertation on Hell Gap, among other things. And kind of, there's some interesting parts of that dissertation. One promoting this Akama culture, which is this like ancestral pan-indigenous group that, not really but he actually talks about what we know as the Frizzen effect, named after George C. Frizzen from the University of Wyoming, who, in a paper described why you can have two objects, two like projectile points that have the same form but of different size. And it was George who described, well, of course they get smaller over time because you have to resharpen the points, and as such they get smaller, and it's called the Frizzen effect. But actually, if you read Henry Irwin's dissertation, he describes the same thing like a couple years before George. I just found that out this summer. But the site itself, like those Paleoindian components, date from 13,000 to 8,500 years ago. And so the fact that it has Clovis, and I think later it was redescribed. It was redescribed. My apologies. It was originally called Clovis in the 60s. It was that Clovis point was redesignated as a Goshen point. So it's called the Goshen. So the oldest component there is Goshen. I didn't talk about it in our Paleoindian episode. Goshen points look incredibly similar to Clovis points. I'm not a Paleoindian archaeologist. I am not a lithicist or an archaeologist that studies stone tools by any stretch of the imagination. A Goshen point to me, as a trained archaeologist with a PhD, who can, put two and two together, a Goshen point looks eerily similar to a Clovis point that has undergone the Frizzen effect. There are people that will disagree with me, and that is fine. This is my podcast. I can do whatever the heck I want, and I am looking at a picture right now of a Goshen point, and it looks pretty darn similar to Clovis. Tell me otherwise. But there's also Folsom, so it has like some of the oldest Paleoindian components that we know of that are confirmed, right? As we talked about in the last episode, I'm very much a believer that people were here earlier than the accepted date for Clovis, whether that's pre-Clovis or just older Clovis technology wielding people. Who's to say? But they have agate basin. What's also incredible about the site, it's not like, it has all these Paleoindian components that we already know about. Hell Gap is the type site for 5. I want to say 5. I might be an idiot, and I should probably have actually put notes up. But it's the type site for about 5 projectile point typologies. What do I mean by type site? A type site is, as described when we talked about Blackwater Draw versus Dent, or 12 Mile Creek versus Folsom. It is the first site with a recorded typological or diagnostic artifact. So Hell Gap being the type site for 5 different complexes is incredible. So not only does it have a deep archaeological history, but it contributed to groundbreaking excavations in the field of archaeology back in the 60s, and there are more excavations going on today. So what are the complexes? Okay, so I double checked my data. 3 archaeological complexes. And I know the folks from Wyoming are probably giving me a lot of crap for this. It's late. I just finished dinner. It's Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'm speaking really from just experience and my overall knowledge of the site. So, everyone forgive me for not being as usually prepared. I realized, to be honest, I needed an episode done in a couple of days, and it's just been a busy time. So what are those complexes? Well, of course, you have the Hell Gap point, right? So Hell Gap point is named after the site. You have a Goshen point, right? That's named after the county in which Hell Gap is in. So you have the Hell Gap point named after the Hell Gap site. You can't have multiple points named. You can't have multiple different types of points named after the same site, right? Because that'd get confusing. So the Goshen Point, or the mini Clovis, is named after Goshen County, where the site is located. And I believe, what's the last one always trips me up? Frederick points. The Goshen points are also called Plainview, by the way. Anyways, and what's kind of, what does might explain why the Goshen point or Plainview point looks a little different. It is smaller. It might be, right, as we talked about, it's not like a snap of the fingers and everyone's like, okay, we're done making Clovis points, we're making Folsom points. What Plainview or those Goshen points might represent is that intermediary period between the traditional Clovis and the traditional Folsom point. But with that, we're going to go ahead, take a break here. We'll be right back, and we're going to talk about excavations at Hell Gap after Harvard in the 60s during the Four Seasons. So we'll be right back. So continuing on, these 30-minute episodes go by so quick. Just FYI, like after recording A Life in Ruins with David and Connor and doing like 3 17-minute segments, transitioning to like 2 14 minutes, like I'm never able to speak about everything I want to and just ramble. Hell Gap, after the Harvard crew in the 60s, was reopened in the 90s, primarily by 2 archaeologists, three, George Frizen, but Dr. Marcel Kornfeld, Dr. George C. Frizen, and Dr. Marcel Kornfeld, and Dr. Mary Lou Larson. And I worked at Hell Gap. I think I mentioned that in the last episode. During graduate school at my master's at Wyoming, I was first I wasn't a camp manager. I was like camp repairer. I did a lot of fixing screens and like water pumps and like site management. And then the second year I was a crew chief under Marcel. And me and Dr. Mackenzie Corey from Washington State University, we have our own field school at Hell Gap. We're not focused on locality 1. We're doing a survey of the whole property. And I'll talk more about that field school fundamentally as time goes on in this podcast, because we are accepting students in the spring. So that will be a constant mention if you want to work with me and Mac. But Marcel and Mary Lou and George, their big idea is like, so the Harvard did their thing in the 60s. Excuse me. Yawn. Mary Lou and Marcel and George wanted to replicate the 1960s excavation with turn of the century archaeological methods and excavation. So they took a piece of the witness wall, and which was left by Harvard, right? They capped the site, all that good stuff, and started excavating down again, taking a piece of that witness wall down. So in this basically, the same spot, but like an extra 2.5 meters over. I'll have the reports and stuff and some videos that in the show notes. And to see the differences. And of course, Marcel and Mary Lou were using different screens to capture more objects that might be more difficult to find with the naked eye. And so the amount of objects that were, what's the word I'm looking for? That were identified and recorded was what I'm looking for. By the 1990s and 2000s, excavations were, they found a lot smaller material than the Harvard folks did. And so really showed, and then also capturing the matrix, the screen matrix. Like, so not only, they didn't just like throw the dirt out, it was screened, it was then water screened, and then the remaining debitage that wasn't washed away in water screening was then bagged. And they were doing excavations, like taking a 1 by 1 meter unit and subdividing it by quads. So you had 50 by 50 centimeter quadrants in which those screen matrices and quadrant bags were dedicated to. So they were really doing precision archaeology and excavating by 5 centimeter levels over, roughly 3 meters deep. It took years for them to finish up. It wasn't until last year, 2023, 2022, over 20 years, for Marcel and Mary Lou to finish their excavations. What took Harvard 4 field seasons, Marcel and Mary Lou did at a smaller scale. They didn't have as many people, or they didn't open as much space. It took 20 years. Like, that's the level of precision they went to, doing hyper precise, because at a stratified site like that, like Hell Gap, where you have multiple complexes that aren't necessarily dictated by stratigraphy, right? Where you have multiple complexes separated in time but might be in the same geologic layer. You have to have control over depth in order to really understand the relationship between in time and space between these cultures. So that's why it took so long. And so more bison, there's bison antiquus at the lower levels, bison and some of the top levels at locality 1. Now, localities 2 through 5 haven't necessarily been investigated. They have not been as investigated as critically as locality 1. Locality 3 might be lost. And I think locality 4 was just brought back into the site. What I mean by that is, like, the property that locality 4 was located on, or locality 5, northwest of locality 1, was owned by a different property owner. And Marcel and Mary Lou did not have access to that part of the site. But recently, really recent, like within the past year and a half, 2 years, that landowner passed away and actually donated that portion of their property to the Wyoming Archaeological Foundation. So me and Mackenzie Corey got to see the site this summer. It wasn't open, but and talked with Marcel about what happens next. And much of the Hell Gap property hasn't been systematically surveyed. I am pretty sure me and Dr. Corey are the first ones to systematically survey a part of that property, because the focus has been on locality 1. Like, if you're a Paleoindian archaeologist, you work at locality 1, and that's what Marcel and Mary Lou were doing. And Marcel and Mary Lou have been, I cannot stress enough, the late Dr. Mary Lou Larson, she passed away 3 years ago. Mary Lou went to school with my PhD advisor. So they've known each other forever, and Marcel was married to Mary Lou for like over 5 decades. Just an incredible amount of time. But the site itself, back in 2017, 2018 was designated a National Historic Landmark, making it one of only like 14 archaeological sites, I believe, in the United States to be given that designation. Like, it is incredibly important, the fact that the site was given that designation as a National Historic Landmark. Like, that's how much it contributed to our understanding of not only Paleoindian archaeology, but like what's going on in the Great Plains. And so it has just an incredible contributions to the field itself. They're processing bison. That's at the end of the day, it has people were returning to that site over thousands of years because it was that great of a location. Like, you'd have to really, in order to appreciate it, you have to go there. Like, it's in kind of a valley. It is shielded from the west. The mountains are to the west, which shields you from winter winds. It opens up to the Great Plains. You have topography that you can climb up and just look over the Great Plains, especially the high plains, the short grass prairie, to look for bison. And an incredible raw material source of the Hartville uplift for your projectile points and knives. Like, it is an incredible place if you're a hunter-gatherer to hunt bison and process them. Not only that, there's definitely over 100 stone circles there, aka teepee rings. That site is known for its Paleoindian component, but all over the property are teepee rings, which would suggest you can't date teepee rings, but people even up until the 19th century were living there, indigenous people. Like the amount of teepee rings that are present, it is clear that was a multinational hunting ground or campground for hunting. And so what me and Dr. Corey are looking at as part of our excavations there are documenting the teepee rings, and looking at the landscape, the archaeological landscape across the entirety of the property, not just locality one. So that will be to be determined. So if you are actually at the Great Plains Archaeology Conference, which is not what it is. The Plains Anthropological Society annual meeting, which is this week, the week of October 14th, in Lethbridge, Canada. Dr. Corey is present. Sometime this episode comes out Thursday. Conference kicks off Thursday. Go find Dr. Corey. We have a poster. I'm not there because I go to Japan next week, but Dr. Corey is presenting a poster with our team. Myself, Dr. Corey, Simon, and Justin Garnett on some preliminary findings from Hellgap of this past year. So if you're there, check it out. And I think we'll be talking more about it at the Society for American Archaeology Conference in Denver in April. But overall, just kind of closing this up. Here's a site that has some of the oldest components, known components. It's multi-component Paleoindian. People are repeatedly using that site over time because of how, for multitude of factors, but also it also suggests and illustrates investment in landscape. Like people routinely are coming back. Like people are starting to have associated place, repeated human behavior, right? A lot of people probably think of archaeology as there's just this one site people were here once. As we move through time, especially in North America and the Great Plains, there's investment in a landscape, in a place for repeated use they're expending energy to improve the area so that way they can expend less energy later, right? That is a time investment. That is an investment in labor to a place. So no mammoths, no elephants associated with the site, but bison, right? Lots and lots of bison. And today, if you're at the site, I guess to close up, it's a dry environment. Back then in the Paleoindian period, when the climate was different, there's a lot of mollusks or snails present. Like back in the day in Paleoindian times, over 11,000 years ago, 8,500 years ago, it was a wetter environment. And so some of those invertebrates that are being recovered under these new modern, more modern techniques than in the 60s, being able to find those delicate snail shells, right, helps us reconstruct a paleo environment. That's another critical aspect of Hellgap, is that those excavations, looking at the stratigraphy, looking at the geoarchaeology, collecting data beyond the points, the bones and the lithic debitage, and taking pollen samples and recovering invertebrates in the soil, you can then reconstruct the environment in which those people lived in when that site or that component was occupied. And so it's not just finding the things, right? Archaeology is not about what you find, it's what you find out. So having soil samples, which is what Marcel and Mary Lou were picking up, the matrix from screening buckets of dirt from a quadrant, help us understand more fully, not the fullest, but more fully, the archaeological record and human behavior, right? We're not paleontologists, we're anthropologists. We're studying human culture. And part of human culture, human material culture, is understanding the human behavior that went into creating the archaeological record. So with that, that's going to go ahead and end episode 5 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm going to think pretty hard about what we're going to talk about for episode 6. I haven't decided yet if we're going to. I think we're going to stick with the Paleoindian period. I think we might pull out a different site. We'll see. To be determined. But until then, thank you all so much for listening. I'm Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover, and this has been the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. See you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.